Here we are in the same scene, and I want to talk about render settings. And I just loaded a checkerboard shader on this test sphere, and you can find render settings here. And these render settings are really important, and they will decide how, for example, here under output, they will decide the width and height and various aspects of your image. And along with this first setting I want to cover, and that is anti-aliasing, which I will refer as AA from now on. Here under General, you have an option to choose Render Engine. This full render means it will render everything with all bells and whistles that you have set it in materials or everywhere else. And without being too technical, this software guy means it will render as it is in the viewport, and hardware means as it is in the viewport but with OpenGL. This cinnamon guy is related to something completely different regarding cinnamon materials, which is a Pixar thingy, but don't worry about that. And we also have an annotation box. For example, when you add various effects here, and you can see there are many of them, and create some sort of a custom render setting, you would be able to save it and then add some annotation just to write down certain information about that render setting so you really know what it is all about. Here under output you will select the width and height. It can be in pixels or any other measure, and there is a lot of settings here. I don't think there is a point in explaining all this. You can really, if you're not familiar with these terms, you can select from various presets, and there are really many presets, and you will most certainly find what you are looking for here, and it will automatically load all necessary settings regarding that preset. The next setting here is the save, and it's pretty self-explanatory. You can browse to the path where you want to save the image, you can name it, and I suggest leaving this for the default. There is no real reason to tamper with it. You can simply leave it as it is. This multipath guy we will cover later. It's somewhat special. And here we come at the first major obstacles for users. This AA guy, this anti-aliasing guy, I will refer to it as AA from now on. And some of you are probably familiar what this AA means. It means softening out hard edges. Now you can see in the viewport, no matter how high you set this anti-aliasing, let's for example try best. So no matter how high these values become, you will still have jagged edges. And that's the reason, because this is a preview in the viewport. To actually see the real results, let me turn this off to none so we will have a starting point. You have to render it in the... Just zoom it out really close, you can actually see what I'm talking about. I'll scale this down a bit. So if I do a render now, you can actually see now that we don't have any AA. You can see that by these jagged edges here. Also here, also on these gray areas, it's jagged, and we don't want it. We want nice, soft, straight lines. This is not really technically correct what anti-aliasing does, but it will give you a really good understanding what it will do in the image. So let's try the first setting that is offered, and that is geometry guy, and let's do another render. So Shift and R, and you can see that some of the jagged and jittered edges went away, but we still have problems here and here, and this gray area looks, well, somewhat nice and decent. So I suggest always, when you are testing your image, when you are doing previews, you can render with none or geometry. But when you want to have final image, final quality, set this AA to best, always. So let's render now, Shift and R. And you can see we got rid of those jagged edges. One would ask, why don't we always use this best? Well, simply because it adds to render time. It adds significantly to render time. So currently this is set to best, and let's talk about this filter setting. Here, if I open this pull down menu, you will see we have many options, and if you are not sure and you're really trying to render a still image, you will use this. If you are going for animation, go for this one. These other are really too technical to explain, and I will just mention this sync guy, because if you want to have the best quality AA filter for still images where the shadows and everything will be calculated really nice, then this sync filter is better than still image. It renders slower, but it gives superb results. Let's leave it for still image for now. This threshold value, it's a little bit difficult to explain, but I suggest leaving this at this default value of 10. If you notice artifacts in your render, especially in reflected or transparent areas, for example, if you have a reflection on your object and you see that reflections, that objects that are reflected inside are jagged, slowly decrease this value, okay, until you get rid of them. But beware, this can add enormous time to your render, so beware when you are using it. Always try to experiment with this minimum and maximum levels guy first before dropping down the threshold. Really, not to get too technical, this means if your threshold is 0, then Cine 4D will do AA on every single pixel, even if it is not needed at all, and that can really add enormous time to your render time. You don't want to do that. Always leave it to 10 and lower it only if needed. And this minimum and maximum level guy are really simple to understand, because Cine 4D uses adaptive mode AA, and that means it will use this minimum level as a minimum AA and a maximum level where that maximum level is needed, and it will stick in that range. You can increase this, but I suggest increasing that only if you see artifacts. For example, let me put this to 1 and 1 as a maximum level, and let's do a render, and you can see now that this maximum level is not enough to get rid of these jagged edges. Let's try with 2 and see if we can fix that render again. And we are almost there, but not quite. So this 4x4, let me render that. So that means that this small area here has to use maximum level as opposed to other areas where this minimum level is sufficient. These values, if you add more and more, both in minimum and maximum level, increase render time significantly. So try these values first. If you can see jagged edges, artifacts, or stuff you don't like, then only in the case you can find them in your image, then increase your maximum level first. If that doesn't help, if you reach 16 by 16 and that doesn't help, then you have to increase the minimum level as well. If that doesn't help also, then you will be forced to drop down this threshold. This next guy basically means you can put a compositing tag on the object. And let me just demonstrate that. I will close this render for now. You can put a compositing tag on your object and simply force this AA settings. So regardless of that setting here in the render settings, you can force this AA to be much larger or much lower on this specific object. You can even drop the threshold on per object basis, and this can be really useful. So it just calculates the object that need it, not the whole scene. That's also the method of optimization. Okay, so let's delete that tag. And this MIP scale, well, I suggest leaving this as it is, because it really just increases the global strength of the MIP filtering that you can find in materials. So I suggest leave this at 50%. So let's now take a look at another set of options we can find here. So I want to cover this options guy, and there are quite a few options. And I didn't want to create a specific scene or example for each of these options, since I believe I can explain them really good, so we don't need example scenes. So let's start. This is really self-explanatory. This is transparency, reflection, and shadow. You're basically will say Cinema 4D. Will it render that? Will it render transparent object? Will it render refractive object or reflected objects and shadows and so on? So this is really simple. This next guy here is limit reflections to floor sky, and it does exactly that. The next guy is blurriness. So here, since blurriness can really give some really long render times, you can actually uncheck this and preview the scene without blurs. You can find blur settings in transparency or reflection channel. Another one here is limit shadows to soft. That means whatever shadow settings you have here, that will be overridden and it will use soft shadows, since they render really quickly but can produce some odd results. So that's a really useful feature for testing. The next guy is cache shadow maps. So once Cinema 4D calculates a shadow map, it can cache it, so it can reuse it. You can even cache shadow maps and reuse them if your camera is animated. But if the objects are moving, don't cache your shadow maps. You will get into real trouble. The next guy is the default light. And even if it is turned on, it will not appear in the render if you have some other light source in the scene. The next setting is textures, and it's really simple. It tells Cinema 4D will it render textures or not. Down the line we have cancel if texture error. If for some reason Cinema 4D can't find an image you loaded in some channel or something like that, it will warn you and it will cancel the render, so you don't do meaningless renders. This volumetric lightening is, let's say, without getting too technical, more realistic lightening, and I suggest leaving this on always. This next guy, use display tag for level of detail, that's LOD. So with the compositing tag, you can actually set the level of detail for primitive objects. And by checking this, you will say Cinema 4D use that settings we defined in that. This is a really nice option here, render HUD. So it means if you drop something in the heads-up display, if you drop something in the viewport and check this, you'll be able to render that with your image. And this render doodle guy is really just an expansion of that. So if you doodle some sketches, or you want to show someone what is your idea about scene, you can render the doodle with the image. Here you have the option to really disable subpolygon displacement for all materials in your scene. So imagine you have like 50 or 100 materials with subpolygon displacement. You can really disable them all just to have some sort of a preview that you are working on. And the next and the last guy in this line is this post effects guy. Well, this means we'll see now for the render or it will not render post effects. For example, a glow effect in the material channel. Here, this guy glow is a post effect. It is applied after the render is finished. So you can really control, does Cinema 4D render or does not render those effects. This bucket sequence and automatic slides, I suggest you completely forget about this setting, because I don't feel that anybody will change that. These settings are really interesting, so I will try my best to explain them as I can without getting too technical or too complicated. This ray threshold, this would mean that once a ray is projected into a scene and it reaches certain threshold, and that threshold is set here. Once it reaches 0.1% of its brightness, it will extinct. Okay? I hope this makes sense. This next guy, ray depth, is, well, most of the people think it works linearly, but it's actually working somewhat differently. But let me explain it just as simple as I can. Maybe it won't be technically correct, but it will give you a really good idea how does it work. Imagine that you have 15 transparent planes. This ray depth really defines through how much of those transparent planes you can see. So it's basically, it can be called also transparency depth. How many layers of transparency? So for example, if you would have 15 transparent planes and this test sphere behind it, you would be able to see it in the render because of this setting. But as soon as you would drop this only by one, you would not be able to see that sphere behind 15 transparent planes. And all objects that are beyond this ray depth would be rendered black. Also for this reflection depth guy, it's really similar. So how many reflections? Imagine having two mirrors. You can basically tell how many layers of reflection will you see. Will you see that mirrors once, twice? So imagine that you don't have this value. So you cannot set it. That reflections in the mirrors would simply go on and on and on until some crazy gazillion values. And you can really define that and cut down the render time. The next guy is shadow depth. And this shadow depth follows the same general principle, and it really calculates the level of layers for shadows. The next guy is level of detail, and it's currently at 100%. So that means if you create a primitive object and give it, let's say, 10 subdivisions, when you render it, it will have that 10 subdivisions. But if you, for example, cut this down to something like 50%, then your object will be rendered at half of detail. So that object with 10 subdivisions would be rendered with 5 subdivisions. Right next to it is this global brightness guy. It controls the overall brightness of the lights in the scene. So you can have a really quick method of increasing or lowering the brightness for all the light sources in your scene. And this can be really useful if you, for example, cross your calibrated value, or you can just turn it down a notch or up or anywhere you need it. This last guy is motion scale, and this really has a lot to do with multipass, which we will cover later. Okay, so I don't want to talk about it now. And the next thing I want to cover is really a beast, and that beast is called here under effects, it's called global illumination. And from now on I will refer to it as a GI. In some other software packages this is called radiosity, but in Cinema 4D it's called global illumination, and that is what we will cover. And this global illumination is extremely powerful tool in Cinema 4D to create really good renders, and it has many those technical geeky settings, but I think we can really cover them and explain them on some really simple examples, so you can really understand what each of these settings does. The reason I want to cover this global illumination is because we will use it extensively once we will shade and render our scenes. But in order to understand it, in order to use it really good, we have to cover that in detail, because there is no setting that can be applied on other scene. Okay? That simply doesn't work. It is per scene basis. There are some presets here that you can use, but in order to get the maximum in speed and quality and to cut down the render time, it is really a good idea to understand all these settings, because that can give you a tremendous power while rendering. So let's get into a global illumination in our next lesson.